In Apex, there has been a total of 17 LTMs and over 30 if you include town takeovers. But in this video, I'm going to keep it to LTMs only and not takeovers. If you don't know the difference between the two, a town takeover means it is forced onto you and it's a part of normal pubs. And a limited time mode is a game mode that you can play separately from the normal game modes in Apex. So keeping town takeover separate from this list, I'm going to rank all of them from worst to best. Of course, this will all be opinion based, so just know that going through the video, you may agree with some and you may disagree with others. To start off, I am putting the LTM Deja Lu as the worst LTM to come to Apex. This was an LTM introduced in Season 4 where it basically reduced all RNG in the game. Every item and weapon spawned in the same spot, care package landed in the same spots, the dropship would take the same route, and the ring would end in the same location. And it was the same way every game. To me, Battle Royales are meant to be about RNG, so a game mode that pretty much removed most of it actually didn't feel right to play. For the most part, Deja Lu made you feel like you were kind of doing the same thing every game, and it made it stale very fast. So for that reason, I'm giving Deja Lu the worst score on the entire list. Now, aside from Deja Lu, to an extent, I actually enjoy pretty much every other LTM that's came to Apex. So although they may get a low rating, it doesn't mean they are bad. That being said, next we have Hardcore Royale. This is an LTM that came in early 2023, where aside from your tactical and ultimate, it removed every other part of your HUD. You would start Hardcore Royale with a white body shield and you could not find any better armor or helmets the rest of the game, and you also could not armor swap because armors would not show up in boxes. At this time also, the ring would always do 25 damage per hit, so basically ring 1 would do max ring damage. This LTM was good for those type of players who like a more hardcore type of playstyle, but I feel a majority of the Apex community, this is just not an LTM that they would enjoy playing more than a couple times at most. So although I wouldn't say this LTM was bad, it just lacked a lot of replayability. Next on the list, we have the LTM Battle Armor. This LTM was the same as the normal BR, aside from the fact that you would spawn with a P20 with some ammo, and you would spawn with a white body shield. On some days you would spawn with a blue, and on some days you would spawn with a purple, so it really depended on what day you played this LTM. The reason why this was actually good at the time was because early on into Apex when this LTM came out, you actually did not spawn with anything. We are all accustomed now to spawning with white armor, but back then certain guns could one-shot you off drop like a Peacekeeper or getting headshot by a sniper. Aside from the fact that you couldn't find body shields on the ground, there was actually nothing wrong with this LTM. The reason why it's kind of more on the bad end is because it really didn't change anything fundamentally about playing the game. It felt like normal trios, but you spawn with an armor and a P20. Next, we have Gold Rush, which was actually an LTM that you could only play in duos and not trios. This LTM was the same as the normal Battle Royale, aside from the fact that every weapon on the ground would spawn as a gold weapon with all gold attachments. You could also even find care package weapons on the floor, so you could get a Kraber immediately at the start of the game. This LTM was actually kind of fun because you could find a weapon right away and have it be usable instead of having to look for attachments. And really the only downside to this is the fact that all these guns are going to kill you almost immediately. This is a good LTM if you wanted to spend less time looting and more time just shooting your gun. But overall it didn't really change too much about how the game felt, and the LTM only lasted 2 days. Moving on to third person mode, an LTM that only lasted 2 days as well. Now, third person can be fun for the fact that in a way, it does almost completely fundamentally change how you have to play the game. But the downside to it that I feel most people would agree with is Apex just does not feel like a game that should be played outside of first person. Although I'm sure there's a good amount of people who enjoyed playing this when it came out, a vast majority of the player base I imagine would not care to play this more than a couple times. Moving on to our next LTM with Live, Die, Live. In this LTM, you could not be respawned by normal means, meaning your banner. But as long as you had one surviving member, every time the ring closed, your teammates would respawn above you. Around the time this LTM came out in early 2020, there was no other game mode in the game that gave you another chance of living. Live, Die, Live actually gave you a reason to stay in the game instead of backing out immediately after getting downed. So this is a good one for all the solo queue Wraith players who may be watching this right now. You would have loved this LTM, you wouldn't have had to back out. This LTM let you get into fights more, and the best thing about Apex is fighting and movement, so you could never go wrong playing this. Overall, this was a really solid game mode. After Live, Die, Live, we have Always Be Closing. Now this was a pretty straightforward LTM. It played out the exact same as the normal BR, but the ring would never stop closing the moment the game started. This made games end much faster but sped up the pacing of the game significantly, making you be able to fight almost non-stop the entire game. Now if you're someone who really enjoys fighting, this was one of the best LTMs to come to the game, but the reason why it's not higher is because a better version of it ended up coming later. Which leads us to our next LTM called Flashpoint. The ring in Flashpoint acted the same as it did in Always Be Closing, but in this, there would be POIs that would have a giant blue bubble around them, where if you walked inside this bubble, you would get healed over time if you don't take damage for 6 seconds. Healing items like shield cells, batteries, medkits, and phoenixes could not be found on the ground, although they still could be crafted at the time. This meant you still had the same fast-paced action that the Always Be Closing had, but it slightly sped it up even more because you could go to a POI that would heal you instead. I think it's fitting that these two LTMs go right next to each other, since one is basically just a slightly upgraded version of the other. Next, we have the LTM Armed and Dangerous, where the only guns that spawn are snipers and shotguns. Now, I may have a little bit of a bias here, but I feel that snipers and shotguns are the two most fun weapon types in the game to use. So having an LTM that forces you to use snipers and shotguns kind of gives you a break from all the automatic guns just one magging you. There has been multiple different variations of Armed and Dangerous throughout Apex's history, but the general concept of it has stayed the same. This LTM has actually came into the game a total of 6 different times, making it the #1 LTM to have come back the most. So surely if it's released this many times, it must be a good one. Now our last LTM before we start getting into the really good ones, we have Dummy's Big Day. In this LTM there was no legends and everyone spawned in as a colored dummy. These dummies could not talk, so there was no voice lines, and the only voice lines you would see would show up as text on the left side of your screen. This also removed all legend abilities and gave you a tactical that would just spawn some loot on the ground, and your ultimate would basically be a Mirage ult, but it was called a dance party. At the start of Apex, Respawn's goal was to make gunplay first and abilities come after. But I feel like in the current landscape of Apex, it feels like abilities first and gun skill second.
Hey lads, come stand here and crouch. I want to look at that dummy fic.
This LTM is such a good break from all the ability spams we see from Legends, that at the time it existed, it was such a good LTM to play for fun on the side whenever you were bored of the normal game modes. And this is one that I actually hope we see again in the future. But now, we are moving into the limited time modes that are really fun, unique in some way, and have a lot of replayability. And I feel all these could be argued to be the best, depending on the person. Starting off, we have Shadow Royale, which is different from Shadowfall, so just keep that in mind, these are going to be 2 different LTMs. This is a seasonal LTM that always comes around Halloween. In this game mode, you come back as a Shadow where you cannot use guns, and your goal is to kill other people by using melee. You will constantly respawn as long as you have someone on your team alive that is a normal legend and not a Shadow. Every time you melee someone, you do 50 damage per hit, and you could wall run and double jump in this LTM. So this was kind of the first time where we got to see more advanced movement in Apex. Shadow Royale is so enjoyable because it's just fun to see if you can get your entire squad to the end game with all of you still being alive, or at least maybe even some of you being Shadows. It's a very fast-paced game mode because dying doesn't mean you have to go back to the lobby. This is a really solid seasonal LTM, but it's going to tie into the next one, which is Shadowfall. Shadowfall is the earliest version of Shadow Royale, but it's the version I feel is actually better. In Shadowfall, this was solo queue only, and you had no teammates. So basically, it was a 60-man free-for-all. Anytime someone died, they would come back as a Shadow, and their goal was to kill the remaining living legends. Once the game gets down to 10 legends alive, all those legends suddenly get paired to the same team. After a certain amount of time, an evac ship would actually land on the map, and you had to run to the evac ship to escape all the Shadows still alive. And the goal of the Shadows was to stop all the legends from making it to the evac ship. And I honestly wish everyone who has ever played Shadow Royale and enjoyed it would get to experience the earlier version of it that is Shadowfall. The amount of intense situations there would be when you're trying to get on the evac ship and there's like 30 Shadows sitting around it was just so fun to play. And honestly, if you're someone who's played this, I wouldn't even blame you if you would consider this the best LTM to ever exist. Now for the 5th spot in top 5, I am putting Arenas, and believe it or not, Arenas is considered an LTM. It just doesn't feel like one because of how long it was in the game for. Arenas was basically Counter-Strike but in Apex form. Arenas is basically TDM with no respawns. And the game ends once you reach a minimum of 3 rounds and you're 2 rounds above the opposing team. Although I personally wasn't a fan of arenas, I can't deny that it was a completely new way to play the game, and it probably attracted players from different games. It even had its own separate badges and rank system where you could get Apex Predator badges for arenas. You could collect loot pins for extra heals, or you could collect the replicator canisters for extra money at the end of the round to buy your weapons moving into the next round. Although Arenas is no longer here, it can't be denied that it was a completely fresh thing in Apex that lasted for a long time. And just how different and replayable it was alone makes it deserve to be at least in the top 5. For number 4, we have Apex Elite, which Apex Elite was ranked before ranked existed. To even have access to Apex Elite, you had to place top 5 in a normal pub match, and then the Apex Elite queue would be accessible. Once you're in Elite queue, your goal was to get top 5 or higher every game, and any game you did not get top 5, you would not be allowed to play Apex Elite queue again until you got top 5 in a pub match. There was 2 very sought after badges at the time of this LTM existing, one being called the Elite Streak and the other being called the Elite 888. The Elite Streak badge showed how many times you were able to keep top 5 consecutively without dying below that. So if you had an Elite Streak badge that had the number 7 on it, that means you placed top 5 7 times in a row. And the Elite 888 badge was win at least 8 Apex Elite Q matches with 8 different legends with at least 8 kills in each game. Although at the time of this LTM releasing, there was a bug where if your teammate left the match, you were allowed to keep your streak and play again. So this LTM kind of became less prestigious with how many people actually used that bug. It was so good because it was ranked before ranked existed, and even now I feel you could bring this LTM back and a lot of people would play it. Now for our third spot LTM, we have Winter Express. Winter Express is basically Team Deathmatch but on a moving train. Winter Express is an LTM that only comes around Christmas time, but this is an LTM you could probably keep in the game permanently and you would see a good majority of people play it. There's something so fun and casual about just selecting your legend in a pre-made loadout and just jumping on a moving train and just shooting people. The goal is to capture the middle of the train, and if you stay on it long enough, then everyone respawns next round and you go again. I think just the pure casual nature and replayability of Winter Express is what makes it so fun. And honestly, I am sad that this is a game mode that only comes around Christmas, because I'd play it now. But now, the top 2 LTMs of all time in my opinion in Apex. And number 2, I am doing 3 Strikes, the most recent LTM we have gotten in Apex. This is the LTM that was made in collaboration with Apex and Post Malone. And man, it's so chaotic that I have no idea what's ever happening when I play it, but it makes it so fun. Even the general feedback I have seen on this LTM is everyone saying it's the best LTM that Apex has had in years. In this LTM, you cannot thirst down players. You basically insta-revive your teammates. They come back with 75 HP. And if you get squad wiped, you get to respawn in the sky and come back and fight the same team again if you want to. And you get a total of 3 respawns. You'll make it down to ring 3 and there'll still be 18 teams alive, and it's non-stop chaos and fighting the entire game. Even when you get down to the final rings, you'll still have a couple teams still alive. And this is just stuff that you don't see in normal BR trios anymore. For the sake of how much I see people enjoy this LTM, I hope at the very least they extend how long we can play it for. But moving on to the last, and this is the one I ranked number 1 or the best. And the reason why I'm putting this one number 1 is because I feel this should be a permanent game mode and not just an LTM. And that LTM is Apex Solo. This is just the normal game, but it's solo queue and you have no teammates. For people like me who don't want to have to worry about toxic teammates or what their team is doing, or is sick of say hidden MMR putting you in 3-stack Predator lobbies in pubs, this game mode solves everything about that. You can play it sweaty or casually if you want, and you can test how good you truly are without teammates. And aside from legend abilities, every fight you get into should be a fair fight as long as you're not getting thirded, since it's always one-on-one. Now, I can't say how many people would agree with me putting this as number 1, but a majority of the people who played this when Apex released would say this is one of the best LTMs the game has ever had. Even now, 4 years later, you will still see people ask for Apex Solo to come back. That is my entire list. You're allowed to agree or disagree with anything here, but these are the LTMs in my opinion from worst to best. And with that being said, I hope you enjoyed watching the video.